So welcome to the Product Quest Podcast. Thank you for joining us on our journey to better understand innovation and product strategy. My name is Jonathan Edwards, and joining me, as always, my co-hosts Jan Vermuth and Scott Burleson. Stepping back, many design and innovation frameworks can be classified into one broad category, which I would be tempted to call goal-driven, in the sense that they first try to understand what the goals and requirements of a group of people might be, and then go out and create solutions that satisfy these goals and requirements. I would argue that jobs to be done, which we are fans of in this podcast, falls into that category, but so do many others. We've often discussed on the show how a certain type of person, like the host of this podcast, for instance, are drawn to this worldview, while others push back against it or even might reject it entirely. Jan Schmidgen from episode 14 offered a very nice insight into an alternative view, saying that design is about co-evolving a problem and a solution together, which subtly contradicts a goal-first approach, I would argue. Another form of alternative views exposed in the work of the likes of Kenneth Stanley, who wrote the book Why Greatness Cannot Be Planned, talking about how objective optimization doesn't necessarily lead you to the outcome you desire. I'm old enough to remember that when Facebook came out, it was so new and different that I really didn't know how to classify it or even understand how to integrate it in my life at first. It was a category creating or breaking, depending how you want to say it, innovation. And one thought experiment I really enjoy thinking about when considering an innovation framework is asking, would we have been able to come up with something like Facebook using this approach? So our guest today is Tom Kerwin. Tom is an innovation and UX consultant and coach. He's the author of the card deck Innovation Tactics, a deck of methods, exercises, and frameworks that helps to make things people really want. We like that here. Tom is also an active proponent of Cynefin, spelled Cynefin, which is a decision support framework created by Dave Snowden. And he has actually co-facilitated a workshop with Dave using a complexity framework called the Estuarine framework or Estuarine mapping, which will be the topic of our discussion today. So I found that proponents of the Cynefin framework often push back on this goal-directed approach. So for one, I'm definitely looking forward to be challenged on this episode. So Tom Kerwin, welcome to the Product Quest podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a delight to meet you all and have this conversation. It is definitely, it's right in my wheelhouse of this is interesting stuff. This is good.
Great. So as I mentioned, you facilitated a workshop with Dave Snowden. Maybe for listeners who don't know who Dave Snowden is, could you just maybe tell us a bit about him, what he's about and how you got to know him and to do this workshop with him?
Yeah, totally. So actually, I'm going to touch on something that you mentioned in your intro about Facebook and could it have been designed in a goal-directed way? And I think it's a really good example because I was around and on the internet building stuff. I was a designer with an agency and we were, in fact, pre-agency, we were in a little startup and we were trying to build a kind of a Facebook type thing. And loads of people were trying to build a kind of a Facebook kind of thing. And we all understood the explicit goals, the goal-directed thing. Of course, everybody wants to be on making groups with friends. And we had sort of imaginary groups with people who were organizing rugby leagues and stuff like that. And it all made perfect sense in a rational, think it through. Obviously, people want this. But we couldn't get people started. And nobody could get people started except Facebook. And I think looking back, we can see there's a couple of things that really were instrumental for Facebook. One was the founder was creepy enough to actually think it was okay to have a sort of hot or not mashed together with this group friendship planning type of a thing, basically a stalking mechanism. And the other was it started kind of accidentally in a tiny crucible of a university, and it had to get critical mass there, and then in other universities, and then it expanded from there. Whereas I think a lot of us who were trying to make these sorts of social networks happen, it's very common, try to jump straight to bigger than you can possibly make start because of you've probably heard of the cold start problem, really hard with social networks. So there's an element there of we can be goal directed, we can do all the logical, rational things, and it can still not work. And that then touches on what you mentioned about Ken Stanley, often going directly at your objective scuppers you. You can't get there in a straight line. You have to come at it obliquely or with a bit of, make space for luck and exaptation and those sorts of things. So that's a little bit of my background. I was a designer, so designer and researcher. And my sort of journey was I ran my first usability study in 1999, and I was hooked. And I wanted to see, I could quickly see when me and my colleagues, when we do our best work, we then put it in front of people, and actually our intent didn't get across. And it's not as brilliant as we thought it was. And we need some way of getting this feedback to happen. So that was great. But if we just get that right, then we can solve all of these problems right. Then we can finally reliably build things and innovate in ways that people are going to want. Oh no, it doesn't quite work like that. And then later, I stumbled across conversion rate optimization, and I joined conversion rate experts and really went deep on A/B testing and thought, right, now we've got it. Now we've got the scientific tools to do this at scale, to run experiments and get real data that's going to help us drive our decisions. And there are aspects of that that absolutely work. Research, user research, there are aspects that absolutely work. A/B testing, there are aspects that absolutely work, but they're not the whole story. And I was there left sort of scratching my head, a bit puzzled, like, why, when we've got all of this power, all of these tools, we can make these decisions much more objective. Why doesn't that work? Why can't we figure out the right thing and then build it? And then I was at a conference, and it was UX Brighton, which I've since spoken at and really enjoyed. Absolutely lovely conference organized by Danny Hope, who shout out to Danny. And he puts together a really good conference. And this one, I think I was just a bit jaded in the world of UX. Went down with some colleagues, and we had a lovely day in the coffee breaks. But during all the talks, it was a bit like, oh, I've seen all this before. It's the same things, and I just had that frustration of we're saying all these things as if they reliably work, but look around, they don't reliably work. There must be something else going on. And then the final speaker of the day was this guy I'd never heard of before called Dave Snowden. And I was sort of half asleep, but then I was just jolted upright in my chair because he spent his hour systematically dismantling everyone else's talk, pointing out that the fundamental science behind it, their understanding, their ontology of how reality worked and their epistemology, they didn't match with how reality actually works. And he opened so many little pathways, little clues to more stuff to learn that then I spent several years after that bending the ear of increasingly tired colleagues about how we needed to do these things differently. So that was my first exposure to Dave and the ideas and Cynefin and some of the other stuff. And that's how I came across him. But yeah, he's been around for quite a long time. Started life as a programmer, I think, and then ended up an exec running a company that got bought by IBM. And he's a developer of methods and workshops, and really a key proponent in the world of naturalizing decision making and complexity science. So that's a sort of high level. He's also a curmudgeon and doesn't suffer fools gladly, and will speak his mind and disagree with people on LinkedIn. And you can see that happening.
It's quite
so there's a public
entertaining in that
persona that is entertaining. In private, he can be a little bit more soft and gentle, I would say.
Yeah. I'm sure. Do you remember by any chance what was the idea that stuck with you after having heard him talk the first time? Is there anything that was an aha moment? Do you still recall that now?
I think the biggest one was realizing it was this sense which I've then captured in one of the innovation tactics. And I think Erica Hall puts it really nicely. A lot of what we do in business is this attempt to create the illusion of deterministic innovation. That if we can master Laplace's demon, if we can just collect all of the data and hold everything steady, then we can figure out the right answer, we can make the plan, and then we can do it and we'll win. And what I remember from Dave's talk, really hitting me, and something that carried on hitting me over and over again, was there are some projects that are like that, but an awful lot of the projects that we care about in business, and especially when you get into innovation, new things, trying to get distribution in a market, all that sort of stuff, that is in a world where you cannot know the right answer up front. You can know it in hindsight once you've done it, but up front, no amount of analysis is going to tell you the right answer. You have to probe, tinker, get signals, iterate, figure it out as you go, kind of fly by the seat of your pants and improvise to some degree, and also try many more different things than you thought. And often there's actually another idea that mashed together with this from the A/B testing world. There's a contrarian there called Andrew Anderson, who's very worth looking up. His website is testingdiscipline.com. And he pointed out you make the most money when you're wrong. When you test something that you otherwise would never have done, and that wins, then you really win. Then you make a lot of money because there was no way you were going to stumble on that. And it's probably something that all of the rational reasoning type approaches, the logical approaches to business, won't stumble on. So it gives you a massive advantage. And it's really sort of counterintuitive that you make the most money when you're wrong. And that's very hard, I think, in it for a lot of people. And I spent time trying to persuade all my colleagues that this was the right way to go about things. But it's not an easy path. I wouldn't recommend it. So
So I
yeah,
think
there are other ways.
you've put your finger on precisely why I wanted to talk to you, because this tension between do we have some kind of rational approach to develop something, and the alternative, which is, oh, I'm just going to go out and work on some interesting thing that I'm interested in and hopefully find it'll interest other people. And there's the fundamental tension between these two things. And I think your exposition really highlighted that, because I think we can all agree also, I mean, tell me if you don't, but that there are a lot of people who go out there and build something that they find really cool or really interesting, and they lose
Yeah.
all their money on it, you know? So how
Yep.
can we reconcile these two perspectives? And I'm just throwing that out now here, but this is the topic underlying our discussion today. But before really going into that, I really would like to be able to talk about, well, the frameworks that we're here to talk about, and hopefully we can get back into discussing this tension later on.
Yeah, we
So
could spend a while on that tension,
exactly,
definitely.
but I also want to provide a bit of it, because I would say on
Totally, yeah.
the on the tinkering side, I'm totally open to that argument. I mean, it does appeal to me on some level, but I always feel a bit frustrated when I hear, okay, how can we actually do this within some kind of framework? I always find there's something lacking. And I think this Estuarine framework we're going to talk about today, I think it goes in that direction. So I would like to be able to talk about it before having a more like high level discussion around that topic I just mentioned. So okay, so you heard about this Dave Snowden in that conference. What he said, you felt that was something that spoke to you, and you ended up working with him. So he's got this thing called Cynefin. So maybe could you expose a bit what that is? Maybe people have heard about it, but probably not everyone knows exactly what it is.
Yeah, so Cynefin, as you said in the intro, is a decision support framework. So it basically says it's basically a way of thinking through how do we know what we know about the world? What kind of a situation are we dealing with? And given that, which kinds of methods will apply in our situation? So fundamentally, it posits that there's three kinds of system that we deal with. One is ordered, and a lot of business is very familiar with that. It's the sort of predictable, we can analyze things and we can come up with a plan, and then we can do the plan, and the plan works, and that's nice. At the other end of the scale, there's chaotic, and that is a situation where all bets are off, there are no meaningful constraints on that system. Whereas an ordered system is extremely constrained to make it very predictable. A chaotic system is unconstrained, and humans actually can't tolerate that for very long. One way of getting there is in a crisis, in which case what you want to do is act quickly to stabilize, to impose just enough constraints that then you can create optionality for yourselves later. And the third type of system is complexity. And that is one where things are constrained, but not constrained enough to be predictable. And a complex system is not like a car engine. It's more like bramble bushes in a thicket. So you can't know when you pull on a bramble bush what else is going to move. You can't predict that up front. You're going to have to tug the bramble bush and see what else happens. And that's how you work with complex systems, is you probe, sense, and respond. And I think that's the sort of the core there. There's a lot more to it, Cynefin, but it is fundamentally, it's a little picture you can draw on the back of a napkin. It is not quadrants because there's 5 spaces. So in fact, within ordered, you've got the idea of complicated type ordered systems and clear type ordered systems. Clear might be like a light switch. You can flick a light switch on and off, and the light comes on and off. Fantastic. Complicated might be more like an electricity substation. We, normal humans, couldn't figure it out, but an electricity substation engineer can work out what's going on. They can go and analyze, if something's gone wrong, they can analyze it and see what's going on, and they can choose which giant resistor to replace, whatever it needs to be. Complex, then that moves into, say, energy markets. Now we're in a world where there are feedback loops and there are people reacting to other people's behaviors, and it's no longer predictable. No one can analyze the energy market and know exactly what's going to happen. You're going to have to respond to that in real time. And then chaos. Maybe there's a storm and power lines come down, and suddenly we have to scramble and take action because there's a crisis, that sort of thing. And you've got to react in the moment. You've got to act quickly, and then respond to how things change, that sort of thing. There's a 5th domain, which is the confused or aporetic domain. So right in the center of this big blobby thing, and you can easily Google it and find it online, there's a little space where confused is like the bad version and aporetic is the good version. And this is not knowing which domain you need to be operating in. And confused is when you don't know and you don't know that you don't know. And so you're using inappropriate methods for what you're trying to use. And this I saw over and over again when someone has a complex situation, something where they're going to have to probe, sense, and respond. But all they have, or the tools that they like to use maybe, and this was me too, I liked these tools, is planning. We've got to plan more and we've got to guess the right thing. And if we can just do enough homework, enough analysis, then we'll get it right. But it doesn't work. More planning will never get you to the answer you want. So you end up taking bigger and bigger risks because you are putting more and more energy into something that is not reliable. Aporia, or the aporetic part, that's when you realize, we've got this situation where we don't know exactly what to do. We can move into there, we can decompose the work that we're looking at and decide, well, which bits of this are suitable for, which bits of this are clear, we can just get on with them, which bits are complicated, and we can hand them off to domain experts who can then make the right choices. Which of these are complex, and we need to then do parallel safe to fail probes and experiment, and which of these, if any, are chaotic.
Could you could you list those 5 again, just for
sure, yeah.
Could you go back through? And is there an order? Is there a sequence, or is there not a sequence?
Oh, so then it gets really cool. Like Cynefin in itself is quite useful, but it just sort of sits there. And People, I think, come across it. A lot of people have come across it. It's quite familiar to a lot of people, but sometimes it's just there and it's like, well, I don't know what to do with this. And sometimes it's used as a sort of well, here's a stick to beat you with. You're doing things wrong. But that doesn't really help. What really unlocked it for me, and it's worth looking up on the wiki, is the idea of Cynefin dynamics. And what we're
What is this
really
word
trying to...
Cynefin? How do you spell Cynefin? What is this word?
Oh, Cynefin, it's a Welsh word meaning something like the habitat with which you are familiar and co-evolving.
How does that
Something
spell?
like that.
Do you know? Or
Cynefin. So it looks like it says Cynefin or
uh-huh.
Cynefin,
Uh-huh.
something like
Yeah,
that.
yeah.
But you pronounce it, it's like Kevin, but you've got a little sort of stutter. So you go Cynefin, and
Never.
that's the pronouncement. And it's a Welsh word because Dave is proudly
Cool.
Welsh as well. Should know that. So those 5 domains again: clear, complicated, complex, chaotic, and then there's confused or aporetic. When we get into Cynefin dynamics, what we're then looking at is movements and common patterns of movement that teams or individuals will make through the domains as they're working. And one of the classics is where they all move through aporia, because you always have a thing of like, we're going into aporia to figure out where we need to go next. Then you'll go into the complex domain to figure stuff out, find patterns that you can then stabilize, to provoke emergent outcomes, which you can then double down on the ones you like and remove the ones you don't like. We can then bring this back round through the liminal zone between complex and complicated. And the liminal zone is like a phase shift. It takes energy to move things from one domain to another. And that's where a lot of modern product methods and things like Scrum and product trios, opportunity solution trees, OKRs, all those sorts of tools are incredibly powerful. Those things fall apart when you go deep into complexity because you can't know which objectives are worth chasing when you're deep in complexity. You need to get things through the emergent phase and then into this liminal zone. And you're moving them across then into complicated. And in complicated, then stuff like Scrum and product trio type work is overkill. You don't need those sorts of fast feedback loops because you can make a plan. You can use more old school methods, call it waterfall or planning, whatever you want to do, requirements, things like that. They really come into their own there. And that's the sort of loop that product teams take. Another classic loop is the chaos grazing, which is just sort of improvising in the complex zone, where classically, I suppose, your sort of inspired consultants can do this, where they're always figuring out new things on the fly and they can design methods that really work for people in their context, but they can never stabilize those and bring them across into a repeatable form. They have to always be figuring it out with the team. So there's a couple of classics. I've got an article I've nearly finished about this sense of bounded applicability and how I think through Cynefin dynamics to think about what sorts of methods we might use at different stages or phases in a product's evolution.
So is there, I mean, in the framework itself, is the idea, well, okay, I'll ask it stupidly. That's not but
that sort of question.
We take the method, we take these different quadrants, and all we want to do is find ways of putting everything into the clear zone. Is that the purpose, or is the purpose just to give kind of some kind of orientation? Hey, where are we? Or so is there a kind of an idea to move things in some direction, or is it just like a map to know where you are? Can you maybe a little bit elaborate on that?
So it's a bit of both. It's a map to know where you are, but it's not where you are. It's where you decompose your work into the different domains and figure out, well, for this, we're in this sort of dynamic. Whereas for this bit, we're in this dynamic. Okay. Now, it is a common desire for a lot of businesses to move everything into the clear domain, where it's all just push button. It's categorize. I've forgotten the exact thing, but yeah, you can categorize things and it's really obvious what's what. It's like which side of the road do you drive on? Where in the UK or Japan, it's the left, everywhere else it's the right, pretty much. And that's a clear decision that you can make and everybody knows the answer. Now, if you could make everything like that, great, that'd be nice. But in practice, you can't. And one of the risks that businesses have is they do try to make everything clear, make everything incredibly regimented and process-based, but some stuff just isn't amenable to that. And what you end up with then, there's this cliff between clear and chaos. And you
Yeah.
can then drop over into crisis because you're using overly simplistic approaches for something that won't work with that.
Okay.
Does that help answer?
Yeah. No, I think that really helps. I mean, it's probably, as you mentioned, the issues start when you start applying methods from one domain in another, and then
Yeah.
there is probably the mismatch. That's when things go wrong, or I would assume that's when things go wrong.
Things go wrong or just are like harder than they need to be, maybe.
Okay, yeah.
That sort of thing. Or you get what you often, one of the biggest things you get in when you're trying to apply linear methods to a complex domain, which is non-linear, is you just get unintended consequences. You get
Yeah.
things like Cobra effects, and uh, Goodhart's law really comes into its own there. You'll get people gaming the system because that's what human systems are. We are anthrocomplex is the term.
Yeah.
We are complex adaptive systems. We're not machines, so we have to be. You have to be aware of that and not try to make people follow linear processes when it doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
One example of that actually that I found fascinating. I was working with a company who were doing recruitment for healthcare, and they were doing like scaled work here, and they'd found like a really nice little niche of product market fit, and they were trying to expand that. Working with HR teams in these big healthcare organizations, what they wanted was for the recruitment process to be linear, to be complicated, so that they could put analytics on all of it and they could manage the process down to the finest nuts and bolts.
Hmm.
I did a bunch of research and realized, no, actually, there's a complicated linear bit at the start where you're seeing a job ad and then applying and putting your CV in. And there's a linear bit at the end where you've got the offer and now you're going into onboarding. But the bit in the middle actually isn't linear at all. The humans are arranging things, and people are available and they're not available, and it's a little bit about relationships and a little bit how people are feeling on a given day. You can't make that into a funnel arbitrarily without creating unintended consequences. It's actually something that's more of a social dance. And yet it was very difficult to get people to allow the tool to be like that. They wanted it to fit into their picture of a funnel, and that created a load of weird behaviors. Like basically, you'll have seen this if you've worked with recruitment consultants. They don't put the data is not up to date in the system, except for two moments. One, when the CV comes in, and two, when the offer goes out and they're in the onboarding process.
Yeah. So where does innovation, let's say using a broad term, fit in that picture? I mean, where in this grid is innovation?
Cool. I think innovation sits in all different places. 'Cause it depends on I mean, it's a big, broad word, isn't it?
Exactly.
You could say it's making things better, increasing value. You can have optimization style innovation. You can also have entirely novel innovation and trying to find new sources of value, new behaviors, provoking new behaviors. And I think there's that dynamic of go into complexity, stimulate some behaviors, see what's emergent, and then see if you can stabilize and make repeatable some that are beneficial to customers and business alike. And that's one way that I see innovation happening. And it often involves another lovely phrase, a shallow dive into chaos, which is where you a classic method, which is very much jobs to be done friendly. I love jobs to be done. I love Bob Moesta's flavor in particular, and highly recommend all of his books. I've stolen some of his methods for my deck. But he has these switch conversations and other kinds of discovery conversations, I'd say, and user researchers have contextual inquiry and ethnography and these sorts of things. Those are shallow dives into chaos because you are breaking apart your potential customer base or your audience into disconnected individuals. You're not looking at the behavior of people together. You're looking at one person at a time. And that's the sort of nature of chaos. And it's why wisdom of crowds works. So I'm sure you've heard of wisdom of crowds. The classic example where it originally came from was a farmer's market where the game was to guess the weight of the pig. And everyone had a guess. Nobody knew anyone else's guess. And nobody got it right. But the average of everyone's guesses was pretty much spot on. And there was another example where a plane went down and they didn't know where. They'd lost contact. And they were able to give the details of the last place it was seen and the trajectory and those sorts of things to a bunch of aviation experts, air traffic control type people around the world. And again, nobody individually got it right, but the average of all of their guesses of where the plane was within something like 200 meters of where the plane actually was found. The key there is nobody knew anyone else's guess. And that's where you get the wisdom of crowds effect. Whereas as soon as you get feedback effects where people know what other people are bidding, like in a stock market or any other kind of market like that, then the wisdom of crowds doesn't work anymore. So yeah, anyway, that was me going off on one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you gave some really nice examples for each of these different sectors. So the light switch for clear, the power station for complicated, the energy market for complex. I think that really brings it home. So what is chaotic then? I mean, do we have some kind of imagery for that or?
Well, I mean, I'd suggested like maybe there's a crisis. So what if something happens where a major supplier of energy is not available anymore? There's suddenly rolling blackouts across a country, or there's a storm and power lines come down. Suddenly we have a situation where we put aside the normal rules and systems and we're going to take action and change things, hopefully.
But that is different to the aphoretic or confused. So chaotic and aphoretic, they are different things, right?
Yes, very much so. Yeah. So another good example, I think, for chaos and how to act in when you hit a chaotic moment is when the pandemic started. COVID hit, and most countries sort of were a bit slow to react and waited and saw. But the Prime Minister of New Zealand took very swift, draconian action to create more optionality for New Zealand later. And it was unconstitutional, slightly breaking the law, but she locked the borders, and that created much more time and options for New Zealand in the long run. So a moment of crisis, international chaos happened. Normal operations were suddenly like out of the window. She acted fast and she acted and then sensed and adjusted as she went. Whereas other countries, Britain, for instance, went, maybe, I don't know. And then all of our options went away.
Can I just kind of, so that I understand this correctly? So in the kind of, if you are in a chaotic situation, the idea is act first. Well, okay, maybe not think later, but like act first. So it's the emphasis is on acting. In a chaotic situation, is you have to move in order to find any kind of way. Is that so? You emphasize
to stabilize the situation.
Stabilize. So acting first. That well. In a sense, I'm asking because it's counterintuitive in a sense. So you're thinking like, let's wait and analyze the situation, gives more optionality, where you're saying now, no, in a chaotic situation, that's not the case. In a chaotic situation, acting gives you optionality later. So I find that very, very interesting. It's counterintuitive in a sense.
I think that's one of the things I love about this sort of framework, and what attracted me to it was elements are counterintuitive, but then they also suddenly everything slots into place and you go, that's why all of this stuff isn't working for us. And that's why we need to think about doing something different. And then that helps. Another good example, I think, for the chaos is, imagine you've got a tech team supporting like a product, some sort of IT structure, and they have normal daily lives and they've got a routine and it's all fine. They're doing Scrum, etc., etc. And then there's a DDoS, denial of service attack, or some sort of major incident. They are going to down tools, get into like a crisis room and immediately take action to lock that IP address down, fix that, bang, bang, bang. And they'll just stabilize the situation as fast as they can. That enables them to then move into aporia and say, right, which aspects of this can we control? Which aspects of this do we need to respond to differently in the future? Which aspects of it, what can we now change?
Okay.
The one that
But while the
basically
crisis is happening, you can't do anything else. You can't wait. You've got to fix this problem.
So if I'm wrapping my brain around it, clear, I think we can get our brain around clear. That's a sort of stable situation. We got the, so I'm going to walk through these and tell me when I have something wrong. But by the way, the thing I'm getting to is complex is the one I'm having the hardest time wrapping my brain around. But before I get to that, so clear, we sort of understand the situation. Complicated, it's sort of like clear plus 2 or something. We're still
You
rational.
can see it as a sort of a gradient of how difficult or how complicated it is. Yeah,
it's still well understood, but it's just more difficult. It's just more complicated, I guess. Okay, so I can wrap
you need
that.
experts to figure it out, that sort of thing. Yeah,
and I can sort of go to the other in chaos. A hurricane hits. Anyway. So just all of your rules are thrown out, and you have to trust your gut a bit. So I can I feel like I have the ends of the spectrum. The complex, that's the one I'm having the hardest time wrapping my brain around. What is help me to understand complex.
Cool. Yeah. So I mean, going back to one thing, the idea of bramble bushes in a thicket is one way of looking at complex. That I think is a Nora Bateson quote. She's very worth following as well. But yeah, the idea in complex is that bramble bush is tangled, it's entangled in a thicket. You can't untangle it without destroying it. So you can no longer dismantle it into its component pieces and then put it back together again. So a car engine or a jet engine is complicated. A mayonnaise is complex. You can't unmix the mayonnaise once you've mixed it. Or a squirrel is complex. You can't dismantle the squirrel, put it back together again, and have a working squirrel. And then you get into anthrocomplex. Then we're looking at communities of people and how people work together. And so in complexity, the interconnections between the elements become much more important than the elements themselves. And that's another of the sort of counterintuitive things.
Yeah.
But as you look around, I think you suddenly start to see, oh yeah, of course, all of that totally happens. And one of the really fun things that then starts to happen with groups of people is you get the emergence of assemblages, narrative assemblages. And the simple, sort of slightly wrong way of putting this is, I tell a story and you quite like the story. And so you tell the story to somebody else and they like it. And so we start telling this story. And at some point, that story takes on almost a life of its own in our culture, in our organization. And it becomes then this narrative assemblage. It's a thing that exists not inside any one person, but as a sort of an effect or an emergence of the interconnections between all of us. And then that narrative assemblage starts to exert a downwards force on our culture. And it starts to constrain the things that we can do. So the narratives that we tell ourselves and the narratives in our culture of people like us do things like these, they constrain the options that we are aware of, the things that we think of as being even possible or reasonable for someone to do. Even more perniciously, they constrain what we can even perceive in the environment. So if you're not expecting something, if it's not within your realm of stories, you don't even notice it. And this then gets up some work by Andy Clark. I don't know if you've read The Experience Machine, but his model of how cognition works, it makes it clear that the idea of mindsets and mental models are deeply outdated. It's a sort of computer version of how we think, like an intelligent camera. Whereas most of our decisions are made in the body or in our social environment, not actually in our brain at all. And the brain just checks later to make sure it was okay. But we're not taking in information, understanding it like a mental model, and then making decisions. It's all happening in parallel in a probing, sensing, responding kind of a way.
I love this framework, and I can see we're even having a discussion about where are we, which one are we in, would be a very useful conversation, because times you're having an argument, but the argument's not really what the words appear to be. This example comes to mind. It's sort of relevant to our time, but so right now it's 2024, it's sort of rampant global inflation, and the more modern economists I believe, would describe it as complex. And they'd talk about, well, we have to infuse cash into the economy. We have to do this, and you have to have government spending and the banks and the Fed. And they describe your hedge bush. They describe all this thing. An Austrian economist would say, no, this is a clear situation. More money, a dollar is less valuable than if you have less. Than if it's less. If it's less rare, it's less valuable. And so there's no resolving the conversation. I don't know if this is a relevant example or not. This is where it comes back. There's no resolving the conversation because the modern MMT folks are describing it as a complex world. The Austrian economists are describing economics as a clear framework, and there's no middle ground. There's no resolving it, other than just to have different opinions. I don't know. Am I thinking about it correctly?
Yeah, I mean that I think that's a good example, and it is. I mean, then you get into the whole world of economics and how much a lot of the maths comes out of a desire that we could have economics that was like physics. And good old Leon Walras back in the 18th century or something, who decided that economies are a bit like a bowl and you could get your ball to stabilize in the middle. And that's just not how it works at all. Have you read The Origins of Wealth by Eric Beinhocker?
I have not.
That is a fantastic introduction to complexity science in the realm of markets, actually, and how it's a good primer on how nonsensical a lot of economics is. It's like nice maths that figures out, but it doesn't match what actually happens. And there's a fun guy in the UK at the moment who was one of the top traders in one of the big banks. I can't remember which one. And he makes the point that the 1,000 best economists in the entire world are all working in skyscrapers as traders. And everyone that you see on telly or in universities as economists, they get no reward if they're right and no punishment if they're wrong about anything that they get. Whereas the traders, they have to make bets on their predictions. And they make money if they're wrong, and they get punished make money if they're right, and they get punished if they're wrong. And there's just such incentive mismatch there with
although not to go into a hole here and deviate too much, but the
big danger.
Sorry, I have I'm sorry.
Sorry, I derailed you there.
Right, my big thought there was not to necessarily talk about economics, but was to talk about even having having a discussion about where are we could be help to have a more productive conversation. Otherwise, one group that thinks it's in clear, one group thinks it's in complex, are very rashly describing what you should do if that's where we were. But really, but they're not even having the real discussion at the real disagreement, which is which one of these are we in. That was really
I love that. And there's like an intuition that everybody has for what they would like it to be, how they would like reality to work, our narratives, our ontology, our epistemology. How do we know things? How does reality really behave? And we don't tend to be particularly accurate about it. But I've got there's this card from the deck, which is
needs versus so. Okay,
this is a massive oversimplification of all of that stuff in Cynefin, basically to get exactly that thing that you were just talking about, Scott. Which and the idea here is, well, the sort of tagline of the card is identify the best way to make all the decisions that matter so that you avoid a futile hunt for certainty. And the story, or the sort of parable here, I suppose, is imagine you've got two gardeners and they want a beautiful flower. Each wants a beautiful flower bed. Both prepare the soil, do all the stuff that's like obvious. And then one spends months analyzing soil chemistry and searching databases for the perfect plants, many of which they plant and they still don't survive because there were many more factors that they could possibly pay attention to. The other gardener, she simply throws down some mixed seeds. Not all of them sprout, but some do grow. And then she pulls up any that she doesn't like. And that's a sort of metaphor for Are you in a situation, and then the back of the card, it goes into a workshop where you divide up the decisions you need to make soon between basically what are the ones that are like the soil, the groundwork, where we know we have to do this and it's predictable, and of course we have to hoe it and water it, and which of the decisions are more like seeds, and we can't actually know up front which one of these are going to flourish, and the best bet is to plant lots of different variation and then see what happens. And that can help to understand.
Just playing like a little bit devil's advocate. I know that's not what you're proposing, but it's kind of in the back of my mind. So I'm trying to simplify it and just I want to provoke you a little bit. That's the so there's a situation and it's clear rationality is there. Everywhere else, basically throw it out the window, make it up as you go along. Or maybe that's so. Where does kind of this, or are there still elements of planning of some sense of rationality in other situations, or how does that relate? Maybe it's kind of the simplified version would be in clear, we know exactly the rules, and then in the rest, well, who knows? Or okay, I think
the question of relationship.
You haven't been saying that
exactly
just to be clear,
what you're getting at. Yeah, no, I know, and this is a really sort of challenging thing. Like, so if you're saying we can't plan, then what? Anything goes. Yeah. But no, it's a really important sort of concept to touch on, which is the concept of coherence. So there's no point doing stuff that's completely incoherent. And to be a little bit controversial, maybe, I don't know who your audience is, Darwin's theory of evolution, that's coherent. It's not right, it's not complete. Neither is Newton's theory of gravity was not right or complete. Neither is Einstein's. We know that it breaks down at the singularity of black holes, for instance, but it's coherent with reality, and we can't. We're looking to make it better. We can't throw it out. Young Earth creationism, that is not coherent with the facts. Flat Earth is not coherent with the facts. So we don't need to worry about them. We can reject those because they're incoherent, but we can also say we don't know the right answer either, but we can choose coherent things. And it's a different kind of a level of, it sets the bar differently. So when you're making a proposal to a boss, say, or something like that, the boss is no longer looking for which is definitely the right one, which one do I have certainty about. All they're questioning is this coherent? Is there a sensible, can I tell a story effectively where there is a way that this can feasibly create some effect in the world? And that's the way to go. The other thing to think about when you're doing safe to fail probes is the safe to fail part. So it's not just anything goes, do what you like. You want to make sure when you're probing, it's something that's not gonna throw you out of the game. You're not going to cause damage, cause harm, do things that are undoable.
So maybe to add to the understanding a bit regarding your question, Jan, I have very limited knowledge about Cynefin, but the way I understand it is that it does prescribe some ways forward within each of the different regimes you might be in. So if you're in complicated, then this is what you should be doing. If you're in the complex area, you mentioned it before, the probe, sense, respond. So there are actions that we can take in each of these different regimes. And maybe actually, could you just expand a bit on this probe, sense, respond? What does that mean actually? So I think the complex area is the one maybe that's a bit more fuzzy for us. So what is that probe, sense, respond?
So probe, sense, respond, I think there's some cards in the deck as well which are all about supporting that. It's at the same time not massively difficult, I think, but it's also can be challenging to first get your head around. So one way of thinking about that is, what's a way of thinking about that? So this would tie us back to the beginning. So one way that we might think about doing a project, say a design and technology project, would be we want to define the correct end state, the thing that is definitely going to work, that's going to be amazing, and then we're going to plan our way to get there. A probe sense respond version might be, yep, that's one thing that might work, but let's look at some other possible futures that might be also good. And then let's come back to the present state. Where are we right now? And let's look at what small things we could try changing at a small scale today without committing all our resources. And instead of trying to guess the right answer, what we're going to do is look at, well, there are maybe like 20 different things that we could start doing, 20 directions we could go in. Let's go a tiny way in each of those directions, do something small but meaningful. And one of the things with parallel, and we're doing it in parallel, not sequentially. So doing them in parallel, we also want them to be not like different enough from each other that they're foils to each other as well. That option A and option D cannot both be true because there's sort of something contradictory within them. And that way we're exploring more of the space and we're probing reality to see then what happens. And it's a little bit like we've got that bramble bush in a thicket. We want to tug on different bits of it to see then, well, what happens? And do we want more of that or less of that? And with a safe to fail probe, you start by doing a little bit of it. And then if you like what's emerging, and it might be not what you expected, you might get things which you didn't expect, which are great, or things which you didn't expect, which are bad. You then can dampen the things that you don't like, and you can energize the things that you do like. And then you sort of build over time. And as you understand them more and constrain them more, we're then moving around the dynamics. We can then bring them over into something where it is more predictable and we can get more results from it.
Yeah.
And you see, one of the things which happens with your Scrum teams and product teams is that they're not doing it in parallel. They will do it sequentially. So they'll go, we've got this objective, and then they'll try thing after thing trying to meet that objective. And I've worked with a team before a whole company who spent 2 years chasing after an objective that wasn't in their adjacent possible. There wasn't a way for them to get to what they wanted from where they were. And so it was not something that they were going to be able to achieve, even though they were doing everything exactly as you should do, according to the sort of, the set your goal and then figure out, experiment your way towards it type approach.
Very nice.
So,
yeah. No, go on.
So is this the same as hypothesis, making hypothesis, the probing, or is that something different?
So yeah, you could say that your parallel safe to fail probes
A/B
are
testing?
a whole load of hypotheses. Yeah, but this is sort of then we could get into a bit of David Deutsch or Popperian type epistemology. When you are making a hypothesis, it's not. I have a massive beef with the way that we use hypothesis in technology. It's just it tends to be this is the thing that I would like to have happen. And then we're going to validate it. We're going to go and cherry pick evidence to prove that I'm right. And that's not how science works at all. You also don't, in science, start with a hypothesis. You start with tinkering, and then you go, oh, that's weird. I don't know why that's happening. Maybe it's this, maybe it's that. You come up with multiple possible hypotheses, which can't all be true, but we can't tell up front which one is better, is a better explanation or a worse explanation. And that's when we then do the experiment. And it's to decide between multiple competing hypotheses, not to validate our preferred hypothesis. You got me on my high horse now.
It's great stuff. Jan, you wanted to ask a question?
Well, no. I just had a. So, I mean, there's a lot of philosophy words in that you're using, and it made me think of an anecdote, which I think maybe to a point illustrates this. So, I mean, it's an anecdote. Don't know if it's true, but whatever it says, I think what it says is nice to know. So, there's this anecdote about Hegel, and in his time, so it was, I mean, one big question was like, how distant are the planets from each other? So, and then astronomers would go around and trying to measure this and blah blah blah, and it was a big, like a competition around who gets the most precise and so on. And Hegel, being a big fan of logics and stuff, he said, okay, what I can do is I can sit down and deduce the distance of these planets just from kind of my seat here. I don't have to go out and experiment and see and look. And he did that, and of course he was completely wrong. Like, it was really off. It didn't work at all. And Hegel's response was, well, so much worse for reality. So So okay,
I love that.
I think sometimes we have this tendency that maybe the clear is where we feel comfortable, but it's just it breaks. It just doesn't work. That
I
was
love
all
that.
I
Yeah.
wanted to say. So I'm
And
sorry.
that's what a lovely anecdote. And yeah, that's a nice way of putting it. Yeah,
So,
reality does not owe you fitting into
Unfortunately,
your
it
neat,
doesn't.
tidy models.
Yeah.
so this is we've not even touched. I see we've been talking for nearly an hour, and we've not even touched upon the Estuarine framework.
I know.
So
Point
it's
three
it's
was
it's
short description of Cynefin.
yes, exactly. Well, I mean, but it was awesome. I mean, I think it's really you really explained it very nicely, and for me, it definitely made some things click. So I'm kind of wondering now if we move forward, or what do you think? Shall we keep going?
Yeah,
You're right.
Yeah.
that's
I've
good.
Okay.
a bit of time still. Yeah.
Okay, so why don't we go and dive into this Estuarine framework now? Now that we've laid the land of Cynefin, tell us a bit about that.
Cool. So Estuarine framework, this is a much newer thing. Cynefin's been around for 20 something years now. Estuarine framework is a couple of years old. And it's something I think Dave's been working on for a long time, which is about how do you map constraints? And then we're getting to something else about complexity is you need to understand what's constraining the environment. And then you know where you can work. You can only manage the constraints. You can't manage the stuff that emerges, not directly. So Estuarine framework really started life as, well, how do we map constraints? How do we figure out what they are and how do we put them on something that we can make sense of? So that's kind of where it started. And for people who are interested to know much, much more, I've actually started pulling together some resources on our website, which is triggerstrategy.com. Yeah, triggerstrategy.com, all one word. Trigger like hair trigger, strategy like strategy.com. And down the bottom, there's a little bit of a link to a page about Estuarine mapping. So that's it started life as this game of how do we map constraints. The other thing that got brought in, the reason it's called Estuarine, is a lot of strategy takes, or a lot of traditional approaches to strategy take a more sort of linear bifurcating approach. This idea that we make a choice and then we move forward and we make a choice and we move forward and we keep doing that and it sort of all stacks up, which is kind of true. But in reality, the landscape is always shifting. So we're not, it's not like we're, ancient generals planning a battle where we know the hill is there and we want to be up high on the hill working downwards. In an estuary, that's where a river meets the sea. What you have is something much more dynamic, and alive. And aspects of it are really stable, whereas other aspects are really changeable. There's a tide that's going in and out every day. And there are certain things you can do at high tide or low tide that you can't do when the tide is rushing in and out. If you've got a small boat, you can't cross when the water's rushing in and out. You get interesting mixing effects of salt and fresh water, and that enables different sorts of life to start growing there. You also have things, maybe there's granite cliffs, which don't change very often at all. They're pretty stable, but there are sandbanks under the water which are moving every day, every hour, and you need to keep mapping those if you want to stay safe. And there's a degree to which expert pilots, expert boatsmen who know the estuary well can navigate quite safely, whereas other people won't know the lay of the land. They won't be able to sense what's going on. And there's stuff that's hidden under the surface. You can't make it explicit necessarily. And that's where you sort of say we can start the workshop with that kind of metaphor. What we move on to is then, and there are new approaches now to how do you generate a big list of all the sorts of constraints that might be at work in a situation. And importantly, in Estuarine framework, we're not looking for constraints as in theory of constraints, as in something that only contains or limits. There are also enabling constraints. So you've got governing constraints and enabling constraints. And the enabling constraints are things that actually enable things to happen. And if you think about, if you've got a situation with no constraints at all, everything is equiprobable and nothing really happens. in order for evolution to begin, you have to have constraints. You have to have some sort of energy gradient that drives something to want to do something. And so that's where we start mapping. Is that good for there?
So like in art, for example, like this enabling constraint, like you give yourself some constraints to be more creative. Would that be one of them?
Exactly. Yeah. Really good example. Yeah. And in businesses, you know, in our businesses, there are certain things are official governance type rules. Those are constraints that we know about, but there are also lots of underwater or hidden constraints, which are just patterns that this is easier than that. And so we tend to do the thing that is easier. That obviously we're being told to do that, but it's harder. So people don't tend to do it enough, and we'll find ways around it and that sort of thing. So this is, you're sort of mapping that landscape of energy gradients, what is hard and what is easy for the people who exist and the systems that exist within our environment. And so you come back to the fundamental point of it, which is you're trying to manage the evolutionary potential of the present, rather than saying we've set a target off in the future, now we're going to march in a straight line towards it. We're realizing, well, as we're marching towards it, the tide's coming in and out, the sandbanks are moving, the landscape is changing. When we get there, we might not like it anymore, and we might not even get there alive. Instead, you say, where are we now? What's the next right thing we can do? How can we shift the landscape that make it in small ways in order to make what we would like to happen slightly more likely?
So does this relate a bit to effectuation? I mean, it sounds very similar to me. This approach of you know about effectuation. So Sarah,
tell me a little bit about effectuation.
I mean, just very broadly, the idea is that instead of setting an objective and trying to get there, it's a theory about entrepreneurship and how entrepreneurs function. And the idea is that they don't function by saying, I want to do this and then trying to achieve that thing. They look at what is at their disposal. So what do I have around me? What are my resources? And what can these resources afford me to achieve? So, you know, you look, I don't know, okay, I have this tool, I have these competencies. Where can I get from here? And start from where you are and what you have rather than where you want to go. That's
nice. Yeah, that resonates with a description of strategy that I like to use, which is it's using the resources that are within your control in order to influence things that are outside of your control. And key belief in the whole of the innovation tactics deck is your success always depends on the behaviors of people and systems that are outside your control. So you need to figure out, I think, that effectuation. I think that's a nice idea. Yeah. And that takes us nicely to the next phase. So once you have collectively, as a huge group, working in small sub-teams, brainstormed loads and loads of the constraints and constructors and also actants. This is a new thing that are at play in your situation. It's worth noting, nobody needs to be 100% right about this. Nobody needs to, we're not trying to get an accurate picture of reality. What we're getting is a picture of our collective stories about reality, our collective expectations about what we can do and where we can manage and what is blocking us and what is helping us, etc., etc. We then bring all of those together and we put them on a big map. And the big map has got two axes. The vertical one is energy. So it's about energy cost. And energy cost is a sort of a metaphor for money, resources, effort, focus, all these sorts of things. Where are you going to expend energy? And then the time is on the x-axis. And that is like, how long would this constraint take to change? And those are the sort of two questions you've got on the axes. And so what you start to do is come together, bring all of these constraints, constructors, and actants that you have collectively brainstormed, and you're laying them out on the map then comparatively. So some of them will take so much energy and time to change that they're equivalent to granite cliffs. That they're not going to change. You can't change them. The world isn't going to change them. They are like the law of gravity. Whereas other things will be so fast to change and take so little energy to change that they're quite volatile. They change all the time. They're a bit like the sandbanks under the water, and you need to pay attention to them. And you might want to do something to stabilize them. And so as you start to map this out, you end up with 4 regions. And that's the next phase. Once you've mapped all these blobs things on, there's another important point, which is this is the whole big group is doing this together. And obviously not everyone's going to agree all the time about what takes more or less energy, what takes more or less time. Now, we don't allow any debate at all in this process. Instead, if people disagree on a particular cluster or a particular post-it, then you just break it down into smaller pieces and then you move them to where people agree. So you keep breaking things down to the level of granularity where there's no more disagreement. And this way you avoid the sort of debating about what should happen, etc., what's right, and you break it down and you're just sorted. Then you end up with a map. Now, there is a ton of stuff on this map. And this is one of my favorite things about the way that this works. With all of this stuff there, the cognitive load is massive. You cannot take this all in one go and sort of rationalize your way through it and see how it fits into your personal agenda, your department's agenda, etc., etc. So when you've got stakeholders who have naturally, they have their own personal perspectives, they've got their own goals, their own things that are going on. Of course they have. This is a group of humans. We all have competing objectives. We all have competing goals. One of the challenges, if you try to align on the right goal first, is you end up with a battle between these different people. For somebody's goal to become the one that is winning, other people are going to have to lose out. And naturally, what you end up with there is not everyone's going to be bought into that goal. In fact, some of the stakeholders who have officially bought in may well actually be undermining it in the future. And then it doesn't work out. They can say, I told you so. And it becomes a political game. So that's a very real risk when you're doing objective first type approaches. And I'm sure you've seen teams stuck with it as well. Trying to decide on which objective we should go after sometimes takes weeks. You get teams who, I've seen teams who are like 4 or 5 weeks into the quarter, still trying to decide which OKR they should actually set. And then there's no time to do the work anyway. So it's all a bit of a waste of time. Estuarine flips that all in its head. So now we're instead just looking at these are all the constraints, constructors, and actants that we can potentially manage. In practice, we can't manage all of them. And it comes back to that point you made about effectuation. We then draw these boundaries on. So one is the counterfactual line. This is basically the line above this stuff isn't going to change. We're pretty sure. We might want to monitor it just to check in case it does, like a granite cliff might crack and fall, and then we really want to know about that. But we can predict nothing much is going to happen. The next area is the like liminal zone. So this is where maybe we don't have the ability to change, to affect these aspects, these affordances, but somebody else does. And it might be that we're on a team and we can't directly affect these things, but we could go and ask someone sort of super senior on the board and they might be able to change these things. That's quite a common thing that happens. Or it may be that other competitors in the market might be able to change them, or a regulator might be able to change them, but we can't directly change them. And then you get the main zone, which is the zone we're going to manage. And then the final little bottom left-hand corner is that one I mentioned before, where the time and energy cost to change these affordances is so low that they're quite volatile. And that can create its own sort of risk. We can't manage them because they're not going to stay put anyway. So what we might want to do is start to stabilize them or put processes in place so that they're no longer dangerous to us if they do change and are volatile. And then we have this middle zone. And the middle zone is where we're going to start managing things. And this is the point where people can decide for each of these constraints, we're going to take them one at a time individually and decide, well, do we want to try to change the energy cost that it would take to move this constraint? Or do we want to monitor it and see when something happens, because that will trigger us to take some action? Or do we want to leave it where it is? That might be one. Or do we want to look into it more, do some more research and figure out what might be affecting it as well, and if there's something else we're missing? And so there's a whole range of actions that you can then choose to take as a group on each of these constraints. What you end up with then is a big list of micro projects. And these micro projects, each micro project is tackling an individual affordance, not trying to do multiple things at the same time. And then you can, there are various ways to structure those into collected groups and form them into work streams that then people can go off and work on. And then one of the things, all making clear?
Yeah.
Yep.
Yes.
It's quite a lot to this. This takes 2 half days. So the first half day is really about brainstorming constraints and making the map. The second half day is all about, now we know what the map is, what do we want to do about all of these things, and how are we going to then take that forwards to form it into projects. And so when you get all of these micro projects, you then need to understand a bit for that organization. How do they manage that sort of work? These are small pieces of work, but somebody's going to need to do them. And they become then a kind of probe, a kind of safe to fail probe. And instead of trying to guess 1, 2, or 3 mega projects, which are then too big to fail, and so even when they're failing, nobody's going to say anything until it's so obvious that you've ground it into the floor with misery. Instead, you've got 50 or 60 micro projects, and it doesn't matter if 40 of them fail, 20 of them still succeed, and you learn a lot from all of them as well. And so there's kind of 3 outcomes when you do these micro projects. You either get a great result straight away, something that's really nice, and you're happy with that, or you shift the evolutionary potential of the present to make good things more likely in the future. Or you learn that actually you're wrong about something in your landscape and the energy cost wasn't what you thought it was, and you need to go back and update that map and think again. Roughly.
Great. So I think we'll slowly, thank you very much for that exposition. We'll slowly try to get to the end. I did want to just ask about how an innovation process might fit in there. So say you want to develop a new product, how would you approach this? So you've probably talked to some users, so would this kind of meeting take place before or after you've talked to users? How does that, in your opinion, maybe you've not done that yet, but
certainly could. So the one example that I did with Dave co-facilitating, they had done this was for a new value proposition for a whole new product, really, and it was at the point where they wanted to cross the chasm. So go from early adopters who were nerdy about this technology to try to take it mass market. And they were looking for, how do we get a value proposition that is going to be workable for a consortium of different companies, each with their own agenda, who might disagree on certain things and not want to take on the risk of certain things. And that was fairly challenging. So they had done early user research. They'd talked with a bunch of people and understood some stuff. They'd done an early pilot and they'd got some data from that. And now the big question is, well, what next? How are we going to work within the market that exists at the scale that we're working at, the resources that we have to work with? What are the micro projects that we could take forward? What we actually did in that case, in the end, after the Estuarine mapping part, we then took those micro projects and kind of recombined them into something that was going to be more palatable for the business at large, because this big list of stickies is perhaps not what you want to come out with. So we recombined them, and in this case they were really keen on having business model canvases and value proposition canvases. So I worked them through the process of taking these micro projects and combining them and remixing them in different ways to come up with a few different potential business model canvases that they could then go and make probes around and actually test in the market.
Fantastic. So I think we'll bring this to a close. I want to thank you again for really explaining this so nicely and clearly to us. I mean, it would have merited, I think, longer discussion. There's so much to talk about, and again, I really enjoyed how you explained everything. So where can listeners find out more about you, follow you? You mentioned the trigger strategies. Is there any other place people can connect with you?
Yeah, sure. So triggerstrategy.com is like, there's a home for some stuff there. There's also tomkerwin.com, just my name, and that links to then, so there's my Substack. I've got a bunch of articles on there. I've got some videos on YouTube now, so starting to share more of these ideas.
And you also have a podcast,
as much as I can. Yeah, also have a podcast, Trigger Strategy Podcast. That's me and my partner, Carissa. And we dig into all sorts of topics like this, strategy and sense making, while taking our baby for a walk. So it's very raw and unedited, and sometimes there are noises and gurgles and things like that.
Fantastic.
That's good. But all those things. And if anybody would like to pick up a copy of Innovation Tactics, I can give you a code that gets 10% off. And that I get a little kickback as well. So I would appreciate that. It's lovely. And if you type in bit.ly/innovation-10, that gets you 10% off Innovation Tactics, but also 10% if you want to buy a bundle of decks. And there are lots of others that you'd love as well. Strategy Tactics is great. Storyteller Tactics, Brand Tactics, these are packed with loads of methods, but you get 10% off the whole bundle.
Fantastic. Well,
Very good.
Okay, so thank you very much, Tom. And yeah, again, would have loved to talk longer, but I think we have to end it here. So it was a real pleasure. And that, my friends, concludes today's Product Quest podcast. So please send any comments or ideas for future shows to productquestpodcast@gmail.com, and see you next time.
I want to say thank you to you lot.
It was great.
It went like that, right?
Yeah, I was like, oh, it's already an hour. And it was so